Well, hello and welcome to this first video about the literature review, which is probably the second chapter of your thesis. First, we will have an introduction to this topic, the literature review. So let me start with a few things. As always, I like to start with the nice things that is extremely useful. Well, first you need to write it, but it's also very useful because it will guide your data collection and analysis. Through the literature review, you will also know how other academics have addressed similar research questions. So that can inspire you also to how you will collect your data and analyze it, how you will actually do your research. So it's very useful in that way. Also be aware that the literature review is a critical review. That's why it's called review and not a critical literature description. It is not a description. And this is quite a challenge. Like I think for everyone, it's a challenge to be critical because you have to report what others have found about the topic that you are talking about. But at the same time, you still need to be critical. And what does this mean? That it is not only about saying like this paper did this. It is also about what are the consequences of that. Like if there is a paper that studied the use of the balance scorecard in public sector, what are the conceptual consequences of that? Like did the concept redefine after this? Like was there something new that we learned from that paper? You also have to report on that. Or is there something missing? Like is there something that came after that? Like so maybe you can if we use the example of digitalization like in the last lecture. So what did this study who studied digitalization in this context build on, and what are the consequences of that? Like, so now we understand that digitalization is a process rather than just the outcome. That's an interesting point that you have to highlight in your literature review. Also, it seems that the literature review is interpreted in two ways from readers usually, because some readers expect you to show that you know the literature review, that you know the relevant literature, that you write the literature review and you don't miss important papers. And the other view is that you guide the reader through relevant literature. In a thesis, I think that some examiners will like to see this, that you show that you have read the relevant literature. But that's not, in my opinion, is not the objective of the literature review. To show that you know, that's boring, no? Like, are you, and even a bit egocentric, like, are you showing off that you know a lot? Why do I need to read this? So when you write it, don't write it like that, because it can be a bit boring. It's better if you write it with the objective of guiding the reader. If you write it like with the objective of how can I guide the reader through the literature, it's better because you will structure it in thinking from the reader's perspective. So I will read it, and for me it will be interesting because then I will learn. And another thing is that probably your examiner is not an expert in the topic, and he would like to read that. Like, I don't know what is digitalization, so I would like to learn about digitalization. Or maybe I know a little, but this person seems to know a lot, so I would like to read about it. And finally, and we will discuss this later, that ideally at the end of the literature review, you will present a map with the discussed literature and with all the conceptual argumentations. So this visual map is very useful. I don't want to say that's mandatory, because it's not, I think, but it's very useful to in the end have it. And maybe there are some theses who don't need it, but I think in general it will be useful. We will talk about that in a second. Then let's talk about the method, the literature review method, because the method of how to do the literature review is a big and important part of the process. We'll talk about the process. But some things about the method of doing the literature review. How do you do the literature review? First, something that I want to clarify. The literature review, or the literature that you review, is not secondary data. That's something very important. We'll talk about this also when we talk about collecting data. But the data that we call data in the thesis is what you use to your study. Data that you will analyze. So that means databases with values on with numbers or interviews or reports, that's data, something that you will analyze. What you get from the literature, is not data. There is one possibility that you can use something from the literature to analyze. For example, maybe you will find, for example, maybe you will use cases from a paper and you will analyze those cases. But that is extremely weird. It's not that common at all. 99% of the cases, you have to collect your own data or you have to use a database. We'll talk about that later. I don't want to confuse you now, but the thing is, just think about literature. The literature that you will study is not data. So I will come back to this when we talk about collecting data, but just make sure that you have this in a post-it or something in your note. The literature that you read is not data, it's literature. Second point, you should do a systematic literature review, ideally, or not ideally, because it's a thesis. So it is expected that you do it systematically. What do I mean with systematic? That you follow a procedure. Again, this is very normative, and I don't like to say normative things, but ideally, you will do a process that if you ask someone else to do, the person will do that process and will end up with the same thing that you have. So the process that you used to do the literature review can be replicated by someone else. That is the ideal. And it's very normative because you have to be in there and your person has to be in there somehow. But it hurts me to say it, but in a very normative and very simplistic way, that's why you have to be systematic, because you are going to say, first I did this, I searched for this, I found this, then I read this, and then I drop out these papers because of this, and then I kept these other papers. Then I analyzed all of these papers, and these papers talk about this and this, and I finish with a sample of 50 papers who talk about this topic, and this topic. That is kind of the transparency on the method. And as I said, it is expected that if someone does exactly like you said, first I did this, I had this amount of papers, I dropped these papers because of this. If someone replicates what you did, we'll end up with the final 50 papers. In the end, in practice, because you have to be there, you have to to make decisions. Maybe the other person will do different decisions. Maybe you won't end up with 50, maybe with 49 or 51. But the important thing is that you are transparent, because on one side, you want that kind of replicability that someone else can do it, which I don't like, and I don't care. But what I think everyone cares and everyone likes is that you are transparent, that you show the reader that you made a conscious and very systematic approach and on doing the literature review, that you just don't blur it and it's very obscure. And as I say, I'm Mexican and I think everything is corruption. So I see that it's transparent, that it's not a corrupted literature review. So the systematic thing is because the process thing, and the transparency is because ideally you will replicate it, but also you show the whole process. I did this because of this, and then this other thing because of this. So you're very transparent. So again, that's the first point. It should be transparent. But to be transparent, maybe you can be transparent, but you don't write it, and that's another thing. Like, I think a lot of theses have this issue that the students do a lot of good work. They are very systematic. They do a lot, they read a lot, but then they don't write it. And it happens to everyone. It also happens to me, and even more experienced researchers. But the thing is, and that's why I have my suggestion: make sure that you keep a diary, that you like every time that you do something, you document it. Like, if you read a paper, if you included a paper, we'll see that in with more details. And one method that I will show you, it is something that you can use, is called Prisma. It's like a structured way of doing the review. And I think Prisma is useful to document all of that. And so remember, in the end, just write it. Don't forget that. So to finish with the introduction, let's talk about the relationship between the literature review and the research problem. So between the second chapter and the first chapter, the two are very close, are very closely related. So first is that the research problem, remember that is based on the literature. So the literature review explains the problem. It's like, finally, you have space to talk about everything that is inside of your research problem, what you wrote in the introduction, because now you have all the space, you have to claim all these things, so you have to present everything that you talked about before. And that takes me to the next point. Do you remember that I told you that the problematization or the research problem consists of gap spotting plus the problematization? So you identify a gap, something that we haven't studied, and you justify why we have to study. So the literature review is extremely useful to expand these two aspects of the problematization. First, because in the gap spotting, in the literature review, you will review everything that well, almost everything that exists in that topic. So then you can claim actually that there are only one or two studies, or maybe none, or maybe very few, or maybe they are disconnected, or they have how can I say in findings that are not coherent, for example. So you will present that in the literature review. You will talk about, we have studied digitalization in the public sector accounting in this context, and then we found this and this. We focused on culture, laws, regulations, and then technology, blah, blah. But, and that's the gap spotting. But the connection between regulation and technology is very blurred, like it's not that clear. That's kind of the gap spotting. And of course, also the problematization, because then you can say that blurriness between the regulation and the technology in the digitalization of public sector accounting, it's theoretically problematic, because we don't know what happens with the interaction of these issues. Like maybe they compete between each other, maybe they create tensions that change organizational structures. I don't know. That's something that you can discuss also with literature. Like you can say, when we studied regulation and technology in the private sector, holistically, we found that structures are challenged, and we don't know if that happens in public sector. That is a great problematization and gap spotting, and that will be also a great literature review and research problem. So the process of writing a literature review is also, well, I envision it on 3 steps. And the first one is defining the topic. And good news, you already know how to do this. Remember, that's from previous lecture. There are, I think, 3 or 4 videos about it. So I won't talk about it in this lecture. So the next step is to locate the relevant literature. And I will talk about that in the next videos. We start with the first ideas.